This is the 11th program in a series of programs I'm doing on wisdom and what famous thinkers in philosophy, psychology, religion, and literature have said about it. The last program I did in this series dealt with sexual desire and what might be a wise person's attitude toward sex. This program will provide some concluding comments on the subject of sex, and then I'll move to another topic related to wisdom, specifically what might be a wise person's attitude towards conformity and being popular. But first, a brief review of the last program. I pointed out that famous thinkers disagree on what might be a wise person's attitude towards sex. There is the conservative camp and the liberal camp. Among the famous conservatives, Plato, St. Augustine, Epicurus, and Gandhi. And among the liberals, Freud, of course, Jung, Russell, Bertrand Russell, that is, and Nietzsche. And I also indicated that Aristotle, one of the most famous of all philosophers, is generally regarded as a centrist on this subject of sex. I pointed out that there is some common ground between the conservatives and the liberals. They both agree that sex is a source of both pleasure and anxiety, that sex is a source of both pleasure and suffering. Let me again briefly review the conservative position. The conservatives claim that when it comes to sex, we should cool it, that we should exercise great restraint and self-discipline. Why so? Well, so many of the conservatives, for example, Plato and Socrates, believe that habitual sexual activity gets in the way of clear thinking. Indeed, the Platonic Socrates says this in one of Plato's works. He says that one would leave alone bodily pleasures if one were a true lover of wisdom. Plato and Socrates believe that we do our clearest thinking when we have the least communion with the body. Both believed that lust is a form of madness. Epicurus, of course, also another very famous philosopher of antiquity, is also in the conservative camp. He believed that emphasis on sex causes habitual anxiety. Why so? Well, Epicurus believed that our desire for sexual pleasure cannot ever be satisfied, that no matter how much sex we have, we will never be completely satisfied. He said it's a vicious cycle in a certain sense. We itch to scratch, and we scratch to itch. So Epicurus recommended that if we wish to increase our tranquility in life, that we exercise great self-restraint, great self-discipline when it comes to sexual activity. Among the other conservatives I mentioned last week were St. Augustine and Gandhi. I mentioned that both St. Augustine and Gandhi, when they were young, they point out in their autobiographies, had much sex. Indeed, St. Augustine had an illegitimate child before becoming a priest. However, around the age of 30, with Gandhi it was a little later, they both took a vow of celibacy. And St. Augustine in his autobiography and Gandhi in his autobiography both indicate that they experienced more freedom and joy in being celibate than in the years when they had much sexual activity. With regard to the liberals on the subject of sex, of course, Freud is perhaps the most well-known. Freud, in contrast to Plato and Epicurus and people like them, claimed that too much sexual repression can cause neurosis, can cause mental disorders. Indeed, Freud, in his autobiography, points out that after treating many patients for emotional and mental problems, came to the conclusion that many of them were suffering from problems created by conflicts between their sexual impulses and their resistances to sexuality. Freud also concluded that much nervousness in people is due to excessive self-denial in sex. Among the other liberals I talked about were the very famous 20th century philosopher Bertrand Russell and Alex Comfort, a famous writer and PhD and MD, who wrote a very popular book in the 20th century entitled The Joy of Sex. Both Russell and Comfort, Dr. Comfort, believed that sex is critically important in life. They both believed that if people have adequate sex lives, they're more likely to treat other people better, more likely to treat other people more kindly. Indeed, Bertrand Russell believed that sexual envy is even more common than professional envy, and that if people have a satisfying sex life, they're less likely to be envious of their neighbors, their relatives, and others. Nietzsche, of course, is also considered to be a liberal on the subject of sex. The famous German philosopher put it this way. Nietzsche said, when two people have sex, they give each other pleasure. And he contrasted that with the way in which people often treat each other in this world. Well, what is the wise person's attitude towards sex? Since again, there are different viewpoints among the famous thinkers. Who is correct? Is Plato and Augustine and that school of thinkers correct? Or are the liberals, Freud, Russell, etc., do they have truth on their side? Well, perhaps the truth, as is often the case, is more complicated than either side is presenting it. Perhaps it is unwise to prescribe a single kind of sex life for everyone. After all, it's quite possible that the sex drive differs in different individuals, and indeed the sex drive can differ in the same individual at different stages of one's life. Indeed, there is a wide spectrum in terms of people's sexual desires and sexual impulses. So that at one end of the spectrum, some people may feel very comfortable living a life of celibacy, as do many priests and other religious people, and even some people who are not religious. At the other end of the spectrum, perhaps there are people who will find life more fulfilling if they have vigorous sex lives. Is there any other common ground between the liberals and conservatives besides what I've already pointed out? And that is that they both agree that sex is a source of both pleasure and anxiety, pleasure and pain. Well, yes, the conservatives and liberals both agree that sex can be addictive. They both agree that our desire for sexual pleasure is insatiable, that it really can never be completely satisfied. And also, both the liberals and the conservatives claim that it's important to indulge or engage in sublimation. Indeed, Freud, the great liberal on the subject of sex, in his writings urges people to exercise sublimation in their sex lives. And what did Freud mean by sublimation? Well, what Freud meant was that we should not use all of our sexual energy to have sex. That would not be productive of good mental health. That it is important that we channel a lot of our sexual energy into other areas of our lives, our family life, our working life, etc. The idea is, if we don't engage in sublimation, if we don't exercise some self-restraint and discipline in our sex lives, other areas of our life will suffer from it. Aristotle provides these guidelines for pleasure. Aristotle said that the guidelines are good health and good physical condition. For example, having a good energy level. And Aristotle believed that if one's pursuit of pleasure is interfering with one's good health and one's good physical condition, in other words, if one is sacrificing good health, if one is sacrificing good physical condition in one's pursuit of sexual pleasure, that is a strong indication that one is on the wrong track in terms of the kind of sex life one is living. I want to switch gears now and move to another aspect of wisdom and what might constitute a life of wisdom. And the question is, what might be a wise person's attitude towards conformity and being popular? In other words, do wise people conform a lot? And do wise people desire to be popular people? Well, let's talk about conformity first. It's fair to say, I think, that when one conforms, one is being outer directed in contrast to being inner directed. And what does it mean to be outer directed? Well, it means that one looks to other people to decide how one is going to live one's own life. That doesn't mean one just looks to one's family and neighbors and friends. It means that one will pay a lot of attention to the advertising industry, television industry, and the music industry, and their prescriptions for the good life. Again, if a person does that, the person is to a large degree outer directed. Goethe, the famous German intellectual and poet and dramatist, said this about the importance of being inner directed. Goethe said, "It is unthinkable that wisdom should ever be popular." The idea is that just as most people are not good athletes, and just as most people who play musical instruments are not very good musicians, well, isn't it true that most people are not good thinkers, clear thinkers? After all, if athletics involves a certain skill, if playing a musical instrument involves a certain skill, doesn't thinking involve skill? And therefore, why would we assume that since most people are not good athletes, and since most people are not good musicians, why should we conclude that most people are good thinkers, clear thinkers? The Buddhists talk about social hypnosis and how important it is for human beings to release themselves, to free themselves from social hypnosis. Indeed, it's been said that in Buddhism, liberation is called awakening because it is release from social hypnosis. Indeed, the word Buddha literally means the one who waked up. The Buddha spent many years pursuing wisdom, and after many years of observation, reflection, and meditation, he says he awakened. He awakened from the slumber of being the slave of many illusions, many false ideas about life. Confucius, on the same subject, talked about the good man, and Confucius was asked how a good man lives. And Confucius responded in this way. He said, "The good man lives in such a way that he does not follow in other people's footsteps." The good man does not follow in other people's footsteps. Indeed, in Judaism, there is a prayer, actually a series of prayers called prayers for Yizkor, which indicate that conformity at times can be a sin. Let me briefly quote from part of, again, prayers for Yizkor, prayers in the Jewish tradition. "For all these sins, O God of forgiveness, forgive us, pardon us, and grant us atonements. For the sin which we have committed before you by conforming, and for the sin which we have committed before you by chasing after honors." Emerson, the great American essayist, talked about his distrust of public opinion. And in his most famous essay entitled Self-Reliance, Emerson spoke about, and I'm quoting him, disgraceful deference to public opinion. Disgraceful deference to public opinion. And perhaps the most famous line that came out of this essay, again entitled Self-Reliance, is one I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's a line I've used in many other programs I've done. Emerson said this: "Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist." And what are some examples of sinful conformity in history, herd conformity in history? Well, I think sexism is a good example. The idea that millions of men over the century, many, many millions of men, and many millions of women accepted second-class status, second-class citizenship for women. Indeed, the greatest female suffragette in American history, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, in her works indicates that one of the greatest obstacles the early feminists faced in their campaign to at least get women the right to vote was the opposition of women themselves, that so many women had conformed to the mores of their time. And so many women indeed did not express any real interest in getting the right to vote. Again, they were victims of social hypnosis, some would say. Another example of sinful conformity in American history, indeed world history, is racism. The idea that masses of people have gone along with discrimination against other races. In our country, for example, masses of people, the majority of people in the southern part of the United States, for example, at one time, conformed themselves to the system, which involved slavery and later on racial segregation. And I think most people would conclude that's a sinful kind of conformity when one conforms to certain social customs that relegate a huge number of people to second-class citizenship, perhaps third-class citizenship. Indeed, black people, for much of our history, were not even allowed to be entitled to the rights of citizenship, and were not considered to be citizens of the United States of America. One other example of hurtful, sinful conformity would be in the area of religion. We know there have been so many wars in history which try to enforce the idea of religious conformity, so that in France and Germany, among other countries, Catholics and Protestants killed each other so as to try to create a situation in which one of them would be the dominant religion and could enforce a certain religious conformity. Indeed, a good example of this, I think, is that in 1555, in Germany, and at times Germany was not one country, but rather a collection of many German states, in 1555, to try to solve the problem of religious wars, an agreement was reached called the Peace of Augsburg. And what did this provide for? Well, I just mentioned there were many German states, many German countries in a certain sense, not one. Well, it provided that the prince of each state would decide what the religion of his people would be. The idea was, whose state, his religion, so that if you were living in a state in Germany in which the prince was a Lutheran, well, you would have to be a Lutheran. If you were living in a state of Germany in which the prince was a Catholic, you would have to be a Catholic. And I think most people would agree. My opinion is most wise people, all wise people, I think, would agree this was a kind of sinful conformity. Remember what I said before, the Buddhists talk about social hypnosis and how important it is, if we're going to lead fulfilling lives, that we release ourselves from any kind of hypnosis that our society is imposing on us. There is a consensus among the famous thinkers that wise people tend to be nonconformists. Wise people tend to be nonconformists. Wise people tend to doubt and to question social convention. And wise people are people who are inner-directed. They don't follow the crowd. Indeed, the advertising industry hates wise people, hates inner-directed people, because it's so difficult for the advertising industry to manipulate them. Emerson, again on this subject of thinking for oneself and the possible harmful effects of society, in his essay on self-reliance said this: "Society everywhere is in conspiracy against the manhood of every one of its members. The virtue in most request is conformity. Self-reliance is its aversion." And then again he went on to use what again has perhaps become the most famous line from this essay. He went on to say, "Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist." It is also interesting that Emerson practiced what he preached. In 1850, the United States government passed the Fugitive Slave Law, which made it a crime to assist a slave to escape from slavery. And Emerson, who lived in Massachusetts, gave more than a few speeches in which he urged his fellow citizens of Massachusetts to disobey this law. Emerson's idea was that if people conformed to the Fugitive Slave Law, if they conformed and therefore did not help people to escape from slavery, that would be evil. Whereas if they didn't conform to the law, if they violated the law by helping people to escape from slavery, they would be acting in a moral way. As I indicated before, to conform at times can be evil, and not to conform at times can be quite moral. An important question I think every person must ask himself is this: how much should I conform? Psychoanalyst Erich Fromm, in his very famous book called The Art of Living, claimed that in Western democracies, people conform much more than they have to. Indeed, an example of this would be keeping up with the Joneses. Fromm and so many other famous thinkers have said that too much conformity is a danger to one's mental health. Indeed, Montaigne, the famous French intellectual, put it this way. Montaigne said, and I'm quoting him, "The wise person should retire to within himself, away from the crowds, to remain free, and to retain the power to judge things wisely." Again, Montaigne saying we should retire to within ourselves, away from the crowds. Well, what is the wise person's attitude towards being a popular person? I think it's fair to say that in our culture, perhaps all cultures, many people desire to be popular people. Well, I think based on what I've already said in this program, you can pretty much guess what the wise persons in history, or what the wise people, I should say, in history, have claimed is the wise person's attitude towards the desire to be popular. Confucius provides a good introduction here and stimulates our thinking. Confucius was once asked, or I should say, Confucius was once confronted by one of his disciples in this way. The disciple said to Confucius, "There is a man who lives in my village whom everybody likes." And he asked Confucius, "What do you think about that?" And Confucius said, "That's not sufficient." Then the disciple said, "There is a man who lives in my village who is disliked by everyone. And what do you think about that?" And again, Confucius responded, "That's not sufficient." The disciple was somewhat perplexed. But then Confucius provided some illumination. He put it this way. Confucius said, "It would be better for the man to be liked by good people and disliked by bad people." Socrates, centuries later, echoed Confucius. Socrates said this. This is the Platonic Socrates. In other words, this is Socrates, I should say, this is Socrates expressing words that Plato has put in his mouth. Socrates says this: We must not consider what the many say of us, but only what the experts in justice and injustice say about us. I have an unmarried friend who I think provides some illumination here. This friend of mine has instructed his nieces and nephews that if, when he dies, if at his wake someone should remark, everybody liked him, this friend of mine has requested that his nephews and nieces respond to the person in this way: "Please don't insult my uncle that way by saying that everybody liked him." The idea is that a man without enemies is a man without principles. And as Confucius so eloquently said, it's good to be liked by good people, not good to be liked by bad people. Can you think of any great people in history who didn't have enemies? Again, can you think of any great people in history who didn't have enemies? Socrates, Jesus, Lincoln, Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr. all had enemies. Contemporary whistleblowers who expose corruption in government, in business, in education, all have enemies. Jesus made this comment on the subject of popular people: "Woe to you when all speak well of you, for that is what their ancestors did to the false prophets." Jesus, of course, was not a conformist. Jesus was not especially popular among his contemporaries, especially among influential and powerful people. Jesus did not kiss up to the influential and the powerful. Indeed, Jesus is considered to be a profound psychologist, even by some people who do not believe in his divinity. Jesus warned that good people, wise people, may not be appreciated by other people, even by their neighbors, friends, and relatives. You recall, in Mark 6, Jesus put it this way: prophets are not without honor, except in their own hometown, and among their kin, and even in their own house. He also went on to say that some very good people will be hated. In Luke 6, he says this: blessed are ye when men shall hate you, and when they shall separate you from their company, and shall reproach you, and cast out your name as evil. Your reward is great in heaven. The great theologian Paul Tillich has pointed out in his book, The Courage to Be, that it takes courage to be a nonconformist. It takes courage to pursue a life of wisdom. Why so? Well, if one is not a conformist, one may well sacrifice in terms of status, money, and popularity. Well, why do so? Why make sacrifices in status, money, and popularity? Well, Tillich provides the answer here. Again, in his book called The Courage to Be, theologian Paul Tillich says this: the pleasures of integrity are greater than the pleasures of conformity. That yes, integrity has its price, but conformity also has its price. I'll have much more to say about this in my next program, but as usual, I wish to conclude with a quote from Henry David Thoreau, who claimed that we are all artists. In Walden, he penned the following words: to affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts.